Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Frank Olsen Twins YouTube channel. At some point in my guitar playing history, I realized I needed a small amp that sounds great and is also very portable. After much experimentation, I finally decided to make something to fill those requirements. This is the Princeton 6G2 circuit, also known as the Brown Panel Princeton. I'll spare you the history lesson, but to some, these amps are hidden gems. In this video, I'll share some of my amp building tips, techniques, and preferences, but also I recorded several songs to showcase just what this amp is capable of, from tweety cleans and crunchy riffs to hairy leads. This is not really a how-to video, but rather a taste of what's required when building an amp like this. In addition to this video, I'm uploading a full-length time-lapse video, which you can find a link to in the description below. I buffed up all the ground points before starting. I start by putting all the relevant hardware into the chassis. One thing that I recommend if you're building any piece of gear is to just hand tighten bolts until the build is nearly finished. Many screws and bolts will only withstand one round of extreme tightening, so make it count. I test and label all my parts before starting. This is the layout and the schematic. I also made a sheet detailing each part number in order of assembly. Before I solder any part, I clean the leads with a very light abrasive pad. You can see how dirty the leads get from sitting. I use period correct solid core cloth pushback wire for this build, which really saves a lot of time and headache from stripping wire. Okay, one thing I want to mention immediately is that I'm building this particular amp with the original Fender ground scheme from the Brown Princeton amps. I was very skeptical at first as it requires many ground points and also requires sending half the filament tap to ground. But the final product sounds perfectly quiet, and I think cleaning the ground points really helped. I'm continuing mounting my hardware, a dummy cap can, and power transformer. Okay, time to build the circuit board. I used a few tools for this, including small pliers, wire cutters, lead bender, and a multimeter. I also made a circuit board holder out of mat board, which I think was worth the time spent. I've learned to be as organized as possible during this phase of construction to minimize mistakes. I check the value of every component as it's being installed to be sure I'm installing the correct part. Then I clean the leads. The lead bender is great for old circuits like this. I do this for every single component. And here we come upon perhaps the most important tip when making the circuit board, which is to check the values of every single part that's being installed. This will save a lot of headache, and as you can see, this part slipped through the first 2 rounds of value sorting. Thankfully, I caught this one early. That 10 seconds of value testing likely saved me several hours of troubleshooting the final build. Okay, all the signal caps are installed, and I trim the leads and install the wiring. One last value check against the layout. The wiring goes in. And I'll solder the leads in place. The cost to build this amp in 2025 is about $1,200 if you build a kit and buy a pre-made cabinet with a speaker. Now I happen to have the transformers and proper tubes in the way of an old mono HiFi amp, and I had an old alnico speaker that was the perfect candidate for this build. As I built this amp, it cost me about $450 to buy the remaining parts, chassis, and wood. Again, I make sure to buff and really clean every ground point and ground lug when installing, and I think it really helped keep the ground hum on this unit quiet. Okay, I wrote and recorded a few songs to highlight the tone of this amp. Each part is recorded with the amp directly into the captor with no effects other than some reverb. The speaker simulations vary slightly, but are generally based on various 12-inch drivers in a deluxe reverb cabinet. No brown amp demo would be complete without a nod to Billy Gibbons, so here goes. This old output transformer has multiple taps, So I repurposed the unused ground switch to choose between 4 or 16 ohms on one of the speaker output jacks. The only mods I made to the circuit are a few protective additions. I added diodes to the rectifier tube and screen grid resistors to the power tubes. And of course, I added a 3-prong plug with its own ground bolt. So there you have it, my take on a vintage Princeton 6G2 amp circuit. If you've made or played a similar amp, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video and song demos, and if so, please hit the like button. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching.